I appreciate you coming out today for this symposium. This is part of the National Endowment for the Humanities grant that was funded called America's Wars. And it's a project where we look at the individual experience and collective memory of how we look and remember war, with a nod to thinking about how veterans experience war and their transition from civilian to service and then back into civilian life. And so one of the things we've done is we've invited people to come and talk about different aspects of America's involvement in different parts of the world and the experience of veterans. So today we have Dr. Khater. He is he's a scholar over at the North Carolina State University, and he is director of the Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies over there. He's written a couple of books, including Inventing Home, Immigration, Gender, and the Making of a Lebanese Middle Class from 1861 to 1921. He's also written a book, History of the Middle East, a source book for the history of the Middle East and North Africa, as well as he has completed a documentary on the history of the Lebanese community in North Carolina, and also curated a traveling exhibit on the history of the Lebanese. So it's really exciting. I've had a great opportunity now to see Dr. Khater's presentation on a couple of different occasions, and it's wonderful. So I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Khater today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be back here. Thank you so much. This is the third time, I think. So, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. This is a small group, so it's good. You guys don't have to hide in the back. This is like my students always going to the back, right next to the door. We have quite a bit of time, but I thought what I'd do is I'd run through the presentation. Then we'd do questions and answers. But at any time, please feel free to interrupt if I'm saying something that is not making sense or you'd like clarification. I tend to talk really fast, so I'm trying to sort of slow down myself. But when I get excited about a topic, and most topics I get excited about, I tend to go fast. So if I'm going too fast, let me know. All right? Does that make sense? Okay, so just quick, are you guys all here on this campus? Is this and this was being streamed where? You said?
It was being streamed to our online students. I think are you up and running?
I'm up and running, but they can't see him, but they can see the PowerPoint.
That's good. They don't need to see me.
All right.
I'm not that interesting. All right. So as the conversation is about the United States and the Middle East, and obviously it's about war, which is what the NEA Symposium is all about. And what today's presentation is really about is how people in the region are impacted or view, and both really, United States role and the military wars that have been carried out there from their perspective. So this is really telling the story as they see it, right? And as you all know from either having been in a car accident or just kind of having conversation over Thanksgiving dinner, there are always many sides to a single story. And so this is just going to be one side. Now, generally speaking, if we were put it in a nutshell, people in the region find the United States' role in the Middle East to be negative. So there, we're done. We can go home now, right? So in general, that's it. I mean, if you look at most people in the region today, you will find that they do not look upon the United States, and certainly the United States foreign policy, and they always differentiate between the United States and Americans. So they're very hostile and very interested in talking to Americans, but they're very negative about US foreign policy. And what I'd like to explain is why. This was not always the case. In fact, around the turn of the 20th century, in the early part of the 1900s, if you were to ask people, and there was a poll that was done, if you were to ask people, what do you think of the United States? Generally speaking, it was a very positive view. And in some ways, this edifice, this Dodge Hall, is very similar to where we are sitting today. It's at the American University in Beirut, which was originally called the Syrian Protestant College, and it was established by American Presbyterian missionaries, an educational mission that was set up in the 1860s, and it continues today. Today, the AUB is considered to be the Harvard of the Middle East. So early on, the encounter between the United States and the Middle East was actually quite positive. It was missionaries, it was commercial interests, it was travelers going back and forth, if you will. And this was premised in many ways. I mean, I think that the positive image that people had of the United States was premised on the President Wilson's notion, which is the idea of self-determination. So after World War I, as the Middle East was being dissected and bisected and remapped and shaped to fit the interests, particularly of France and England, and this comes to be known famously as Sykes-Picot Agreement for the French and the general figures that actually divided the Middle East into what we know today. The reality is Wilson was standing as an opposition to that. He was standing in opposition, at least theoretically, to the idea of empire. The French and the British had controlled most of the region since the early 1800s, and Wilson stood, and the United States stood, as an opposition to this idea of continuing empire. And so there was a fairly positive experience. This changes after World War II. So until World War II, again, if you were to look at how most people encountered the United States, it was fairly positive, including, by the way, very large number of Arabs who traveled to the United States and immigrated here between 1880 and 1930. So there was an early wave of immigration coming to the United States specifically for work and education and so on and so forth. After World War II, that changes dramatically. And that's the moment, if you will, World War II, when the United States becomes the imperial power in the Middle East. And I think that's the key element in understanding the shift in how people began to relate to the Middle East, where before the United States had really little to no interest in being an imperial presence there. Before World War I, really, we weren't much of an empire, except for the Philippines and the Cuba situation. But it was still the French and the British who were in control. After World War II, it was becoming evident that the United States was, in essence, the power in the region, and it was wielding its power. From that point forward, there were two elements that most people thought the United States was interested in terms of the Middle East. One is oil, and the second is Israel. Now, this idea, this double strategy created a situation in which the United States was, in essence, supporting some of the most authoritarian regimes, Saudi Arabia being one example, specifically because we were interested in oil, and two, because of various sympathies, as well as strategic interests, the United States was steadfastly behind the State of Israel from the moment of its creation in 1948 throughout. Is this making sense? So, until World War II, fairly positive views. After World War II, things begin to change. So I want to explore a little bit more what this means. I don't know how many of you have ever encountered the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but in a nutshell, in a very sort of brief Reader's Digest version, basically it's a struggle of two groups of people, Palestinian Arabs and Zionist Jews, who wanted the same piece of land. We call it Palestine, and it's on the Eastern Mediterranean between Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt. So if you look at a map, you'll find it there. So in 1948, the State of Israel was created to fulfill the dreams of primarily European Jews who needed a homeland. The problem with that is that those who are living there, Palestinian Arabs, were kicked out. So about 700,000 out of the 800,000 people who lived originally in this area we call Palestine were driven out by the new occupiers of the land and the newly created State of Israel. So as you can see from these two images, there were two reactions. For those who had lived there and been part of it, they lost their home. For those who had been seeking a home, for the Jews, this was a major victory. And for the Israelis, they call it the War of Independence. For the Palestinians, they call it the Nakba, which in Arabic means the disaster. So immediately in 1948, at that moment, the Middle East became embroiled in an incredibly tense relationship between both the Israelis and the Jews. The United States from that moment forward, although it supported, if you will, the Israelis, it wasn't only just there that it was involved. In fact, the United States becomes very heavily involved in the politics of the region. Probably the most famous of this is our intervention in Iran. So how many of you know much about Iran? Have you been following the news at all? And generally speaking, if you were to characterize the relationship between the United States and Iran today, would you consider it positive, negative, neutral? Negative. It's fairly negative. In fact, you know, there have been drums of war that have been beaten for at least 20-some years. The United States and Iran have a very complicated relationship, and we can talk more about why it's complicated. But in some ways, we are so focused on this, but for many Iranians, this is a moment when the United States comes into their view. This is in the 1950s. So the story is really quite simple here. We have a prime minister, Mr. Mohammad Mossadegh, who was elected by the Iranian parliament in the 1950s, and who basically was a very popular figure against the ruler of the country, the Shah of Iran, which Shah means king in Persian. At that point, however, the United States was very much embroiled in the Cold War. And what is the Cold War? How do we define the Cold War? Sorry? Yes, absolutely. Also proxy, war of proxy. So between whom and whom? The Soviet Union and the United States. So the world was in essence being divided into two camps after World War II, the Soviet Union, the communist world, and the United States. And into this mix, the problem for most of the world, they didn't want to belong into either. There's a movement called non-aligned movement that stretches from Indonesia to Egypt to West Africa that really did not want anything to do with either. However, from the point of view of the United States, you could not be neutral. And in the case of Iran, which was bordering on the Soviet Union, for Iran to be neutral was not considered to be acceptable at all. So when Mossadegh becomes the prime minister of Iran, and when the Shah of Iran, who was considered to be an ally of the United States, is ejected out of Iran, the United States is very alarmed. And it sees this as a prelude for the fact that what's going to happen in Iran is going to become communist. Now, if you look at the map of the Middle East, Iran is very close to Saudi Arabia, which basically means what? So what? Iran is close to Saudi Arabia. Why would we care?
That's our rule.
Right. So again, think oil. Here, oil is an incredible strategic value. Not so much because we heavily depend on Middle Eastern oil. In fact, at the height of our dependency on Middle Eastern oil, we imported 16% of our needs. But oil was absolutely essential to the world economy, and the United States was at the heart of the world economy. Europe, Japan desperately needed Saudi oil. So if you think from the point of view of the Cold War planners, if Iran is neutral, and it's so close to the Soviet Union, it means that the Soviet Union could possibly overrun it, and as such threaten the oil fields in Saudi Arabia. Again, in hindsight, this may seem like a ridiculously paranoid way of thinking, but not necessarily in the 1950s. The point is, this is one of the few moments, I suppose, where the paranoia in the Middle East about the United States constantly being interventionist is true. Because in essence, we do have a CIA plot that overthrows Mossadegh and brings back the Shah of Iran. Now, how many of you knew that we did this in the 1950s in Iran? Aside of the wonderful faculty that you have. See, I'm not looking at them, they already know this. So how many of you sort of studied this in high school? You didn't study that we overthrew a little bit. Well, that's good. Which high school did you go to?
I went to Carey High. The only reason I was like, about like the Shah and stuff like that is we read the book Persepolis.
Oh, yes. Excellent. That's great. Good teacher you have. So most of you obviously have not encountered this. But I can guarantee you that every Iranian kid in high school studied this, knew this. Every Iranian knew that getting rid of Mossadegh and bringing back the Shah of Iran, and I'll explain why that was really such a problematic notion, was the work of the United States administration. Now, have you been following the Russia stuff? Would you say that most Americans would be really pissed off if somebody intervened and manipulated the elections? And I don't care whether you like Mr. Trump or don't like Mr. Trump. But generally speaking, would you think that if we find that another foreign power has actually controlled who controls the United States, would that be irritating to you? Irritating enough to do what? Sorry? Fight back? Try and stop them? So on and so forth, right? Because it's completely is against the sovereignty of the nation. So we don't really study this very much, but as I said, I guarantee you Iranians of all classes and shades grew up in the 60s and 70s learning that the Shah of Iran is in power because the United States put him there. Now, I think that's a bit of an over-exaggeration of the role of the United States, but nonetheless, we played a key role. I mean, we literally sent CIA agents with briefcases with millions of dollars to buy off the generals of the Iranian army. Right? So it was a really clear violation of national sovereignty, intervention. From the point of view, again, of the United States, we were doing it because we didn't want Iran to become communist. That was the bigger goal. From the point of view of Iranians, they could have given it a rip what the United States wanted to do. They saw it as absolute violation of their national sovereignty. Right? Now, if the Shah was a decent ruler, perhaps this would have gone along okay. But the problem is we brought back a man who creates an authoritarian system that in essence becomes corrupt, that oppresses its people, including torture and throwing them in jail, and ultimately in 1978, 1979, he is overthrown. And that is when we have the Islamic revolution in Iran. First, the Iranian revolution, which turns Islamic. Are you still with me here? So he's brought back in the 1950s. About 20 years later, he is ejected. And in many ways, the setup for ejecting him was also rejection of the United States. So when you have people chanting down with the Shah, they're also saying death to America. And now all of a sudden there's a context because it seems like, wow, there's a reason for this, that they are doing this. Is this making sense so far? So again, I'm giving you a little bit of a long, well, I'm a historian, so it's my job to give you the history. But I think it's important to understand the context here before we get to the point of the Gulf Wars, which is what we're going to be focusing on. But the point I'm trying to make here is that without historical context to understanding why somebody would chant death to the United States, it would appear that there's something wrong with them, right? Because if there is no historical context, if we do not understand why somebody would be really pissed off enough to say such a horrible thing, then what other explanations do we have left? A, they are mentally ill. A whole nation usually isn't mentally ill. Or B, what would it be? What would be another explanation if we don't have a historical context why people are pissed off? Any ideas? It's either their culture or religion. And the explanation that we always default to is they're Muslims. And that explains everything. So in fact, being Muslim becomes automatically, as we will see later, by the way, and we'll come back to this, especially, and this is not at the level of just simply popular view, but also people, political scientists like Samuel Huntington, who wrote a book, a very powerful book called The Clash of Civilization. He argues that, in fact, Muslims and the West will never see eye to eye because they are different cultural civilizations and creatures. And in fact, the next war he predicted is not a war over resources or politics, but it's a war over culture between Islam and the West. That is his prediction, because there's something inherently, profoundly different between the two. And by the way, this is an explanation that is not just Samuel Huntington. This is something that is very common to American society, in which Muslims are seen as inherently anti-American because of who they are in religion. And we can discuss this more. But I wanted to point out very quickly here that this is not just out of the blue that somebody would shout death to America, justified or otherwise. I'm not here to support one argument. What I'm saying is there's a historical context in which they felt that the United States was, in essence, ruining their lives. So there's this background. And it's not only in Iran that we intervened, but in fact, in many ways, we also were very interventionist in places like Egypt and the Suez Crisis. So the Suez Crisis, very briefly, this is in 1956, not really to get into too much of the history, but in essence, Nasser was the president of Egypt, right here. A very popular president, a very populist president, who was beginning to really transform Egypt as a whole, from an agrarian society to an industrialized society, from a peasant society to a city society. And he is incredibly popular. When he died, there were 2 million people who walked in his funeral. 2 million, right? I mean, that is basically one, at that point anyway, like 1 out of 20 people in Egypt were walking in this man's funeral. So he was not unpopular by any stretch of the imagination. In 1956, he nationalizes, what is nationalizes? The Suez Canal. You all know what the Suez Canal is? It's that stretch of waterways that connects, in essence, the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean. Really vital link in terms of waterway shipping. So what does it mean when I say he nationalized it? Sorry? The government, in essence, says this is now a national asset. So think of national parks, right? You take a large amount of land and say now it's federal land, and you cannot just do whatever you want. And from the point of view of Nasser, this was critical. The British and the French were very unhappy with him, and as such, they attack and take over the Suez Canal. But what's more important to me is this. In order to explain why the French and the British were able to defeat very quickly the Suez Crisis and the 1967 war, the Egyptians resorted to this explanation. Can you all see it? This is a kind of a comic novel that was done in Arabic, obviously, about the 1967 war. And so what is it arguing here? If you read this, if you think of this as a primary source, what is this telling us about the 1967 war?
We're just curious about what the Soviet Union is getting to and where it is.
Okay. What else does it say? It did not surprise America. You all know what the 1967 war is, or have you ever studied it? So, the Six-Day War is a war between, it's a third war between Israel and the Arab states, in which Israel, in essence, thoroughly, within about 6 hours, defeats the Arab armies, combined Arab armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. It was a devastating defeat for the Arabs, a glorious victory for the Israelis, and an acquisition of the Sinai Peninsula and a lot of territory. And Nasser was absolutely humiliated. But I would like you to sort of think a little bit about, they're trying to explain why this happened. Okay? And the story is, if you look at the military history of this conflict, and I said, I mean, the Arabs call it the 67 War, so it gives them a year. Most of the world calls it the 6-day war, so it's a little less glorious. But in essence, it was a 6-hour war because the Israeli Air Force decimated all the Arab Air Force on the ground. And one of the key elements of that was that the Israelis, again, sorry, I don't have a map. I wish I had a map to show you. But if you think of the Mediterranean, think about the Mediterranean coast, the Israelis flew west, past Egypt, then did a U-turn and came back and attacked Egypt from behind. It was not believed to have, I mean, the Egyptians had all their surface-to-air missiles, all their air defense pointing at Israel, but the Israelis bypassed them and came from behind. Long story short, they were decimating all that. For the Arabs, the only explanation that the Israelis were able to do that is that the Israeli jets were flown by Americans. So the myth, or the fake news as in today's parlance, is that the United States was involved and the American pilots flew Israeli jets and attacked the Arab world. That is not true. It did not happen that way at all. In 1973, we do something, but that's a different story. But think for a moment, why would it become so commonly accepted that the United States would take its pilots and put them in Israeli jets? What does that tell us about the mindset of the people there? I'm not talking about facts or reality.
They're still concerned with those intervening,
Okay, so, and why would they be concerned with that?
well, because we're messing with their national sovereignty.
So they have an evidence that we did it before, and now we have evidence of doing it again. Now, of course, Nasser was using this as a way of saying it's not my fault. Right? I mean, it's a very nice way of saying we have a lot of politicians who avoid responsibility, and Nasser is no different. It's like somebody else's fault. And in this instance, it's the United States. But the point here, he chose the United States, not out of the blue. He chose the United States because he knew it would resonate with the majority of the people living here. And again, here's my point. After 1948, people were willing to believe that the United States is going to intervene again and again and again to the detriment of the people in the region. And we did it enough times that it was true. So after 1967, America becomes the enemy. Again, before 1948, the United States was not seen as the enemy. After 1948, with a combination of our interventions, our support for fairly dictatorial regimes who have oil, like the Saudis, and certainly our support for the State of Israel, combined to make the United States the enemy. But more importantly, and this is kind of an explanation of how we end up with the Gulf War to a certain extent, more importantly, this is the end of what we call Arabism. And Arabism is the idea of a secular nationalist movement that coursed through the Middle East in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. With the defeat of 1967, the secular idea of nationalism died, and there's a political vacuum. And in its place comes the rise of Islamic political thought, Islamism. And here I want to emphasize something very quickly. Islam and Islamism are not the same thing. What is Islam, if you think about it? A religion, a faith, like Judaism, like Christianity. And what is Islamism? It's a political, it's the use of Islam as a political ideology. And every religion, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, you name it, that's a very common element within most religious faith. And that some element of society is going to take that and use it as a political ideology. Islam is no different than that. In the 1960s, beginning in the late 1960s and throughout the 70s and 80s, Islam emerges as an alternative. Because for most people in the Middle East, the argument was, we tried socialism, it failed. We tried capitalism, it failed. Let's try Islamism. Now, not everybody followed that, but it certainly becomes a very powerful element. And by the way, this guy that you're seeing right here, his name is Sayyid Qutb. He's an Egyptian intellectual, and he's probably one of the key figures, one of the founders of the Islamic political thought that ultimately leads to organizations such as Al-Qaeda. Right? He's the guy who, in many ways, transforms the concept of jihad from a defensive mechanism to an offensive mechanism. And he's really profoundly influential in many ways as an intellectual. And he was educated in the United States. He was educated in Colorado, in Greeley. Does anyone know where Greeley is? You wouldn't. It's a farming town. I always joke that's why he was radicalized. They sent him to Greeley. But it's not really what that is. He came to the United States in the early 1950s, and for him, he became radicalized because on one hand, he arrived here to get a master's in education, thinking of the United States as an ideal utopian society, democracy and so on and so forth. He arrives in the 50s here, and you can tell he's a fairly dark man, as a lot of Egyptians are. And what do you think he encountered? Yeah, right? I mean, what he encountered in the United States were two things that really, really in many ways dispelled any notion for him that the United States can be a model in the Middle East. One is racism that he himself encountered. And by the way, he himself was a racist. He didn't like blacks too much. And he was always distancing himself from them because he thought they were lesser than him. But at the same time, he was the recipient of racism as well. But more importantly than that, he saw America as an empty consumer society with no morals. And as such, it was not a model for anything as far as he was concerned. And he goes back and he writes some of the most influential, his influential writings were in jail. So what I'm saying here is that in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, we begin to see the rise of these Islamist movements. Sayyid Qutb, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Islamist organization in Egypt and other places. In Iran, I think what becomes the powerful element is the Iranian Revolution. And that idea of the moral bankruptcy of the American model gets translated into Iran into a very interesting word that is West toxification. That is, the West is poisoning us. They're sending us their worst things. And you have to remember that in the late 1970s, early 80s, we're beginning to see the rise, not the rise, but the acceleration of the idea of globalization. Okay, so what is globalization?
World government, pretty much.
Well, not necessarily world government. Globalization is not necessarily based on government. It's based on something else. Can you think of what globalization is? What is it to you? Right? I mean, it's something that we talk about a lot and people complain about it. In the most recent elections, that was an issue, actually.
Like immigration, everyone coming together, having one melting pot of the culture.
So at one level, there is this idea that globalization is the free flow of ideas, commodities, and people. So increasingly, the boundaries, the national boundaries that control that flow is supposedly being erased. Now, the truth of the matter is, human beings have been flowing, ideas have been flowing, and commodities have been flowing throughout human history. We wouldn't have come out of Africa early on in our history if we weren't flowing and migrating. That is a normal aspect of human history. You see it all along. But with the rise of nation states, especially after World War II, borders become so essential to defining nations. United States, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, England, France. And states become very jealous about these borders. So in the second half of the 20th century, though, what we see is that those borders become more and more irrelevant. International corporations, immigration, education, like myself and other people flowing back and forth. This idea of globalization is that those boundaries become irrelevant. Now, as you can tell, during the most recent election, that was an issue, right? The idea of America first was brought up over and over again. You know that Mr. Trump used that as a concept, which basically means that we just close off our borders. We don't want people to come in here. Our economy is going to be controlled. It's, again, raising the wall is a metaphor for that. It's a metaphor for the anxiety that globalization brings about. The browning of America after the 1965 Johnson Act, and the fact that American economy is shifting dramatically because of international competition, and so on and so forth. So globalization has created anxiety for us, and we are at the heart of the world capitalist system. I mean, we are the center of it, and yet there's anxiety. So now you can begin to understand some of the anxieties that people were feeling in the 70s, 80s in the region. Because to them, that's when it first started hitting. That is when Western products, Western ideas, and Western people, civilian as well as military, are making greater and greater presence felt. So take, for example, something like this. Let's pretend for a moment that you are a young teenager in Cairo, Egypt, in the late 1970s, early 80s. Okay? And now we have something called satellite dishes. I know they're so quaint. It's like cassette tapes for you people, right? You know what satellite dishes are, right? This is how people used to transmit around boundaries. Now, until the 1970s, if you were to watch media of any sort, print or audiovisual, generally speaking, it's the government that controlled it. Or there were a few FM stations, whatever. It's very limited. What happens with the satellite dish? that you put on top of a building in a small neighborhood in Cairo. What do you think happens? Yes, of course. Now you have Australian soap operas, you have Italian game shows, and you have Baywatch. Have you ever watched Baywatch? You're not missing much. But it is in essence soft pornography. That's what it is. I mean, to be very blunt, it's not like a character-driven show with deep drama and thought. It's about people wearing skimpy outfits and jogging along on the beaches in California, and the camera always points you where it wants to point you. Right? So imagine for a moment then that you are sitting as a teenager in Cairo, and public education system requires 1 hour of religious education every day. I think it's increased since then. But let's say for a moment you are just going in, your teacher is telling you how to uphold morals, good Muslim or Christian morals, because there are Christians in Egypt, depending on, and you are to do the right thing, and you have to be without sin. You know, the usual religious education. I don't know how many of you have attended Sabbath school or Sunday school. I teach Sunday school, and I sort of try to instill good values in people, I think. So great, so you leave school. Now in the early 80s, Egypt, Tunisia, and most of the Middle East and North Africa are encountering a new economic situation in which you no longer can be a member of the middle class unless two people are working, the mom and the dad, just like here. So this is, again, a global change. So you go home, latchkey kid, as we would call it, and you turn on the television. And let's just say Baywatch is on. Now right there, right in that moment, is a clash of two things pulling at you, right? Because what are you trying to decide right at that moment? Should I watch Baywatch? And why is that a question, by the way? Why is it even a question?
Because he was taught that wasn't.
Yeah, because Baywatch embodies, literally, the very wrong values that his teacher or her teacher had just told him about. Do you see the point I'm trying to get here? So where before you had some buffer, some distance, some time for things to float and clash, now it's like you just turn on the television. And bingo, that signal is coming in, and you have to make a decision. If you're a teenager, what do you think you will decide?
Baywatch.
Well done. Close the shutters, invite your friends, and have a party. Right? I mean, we talked today about pornography and its ubiquity. Again, for them, at that moment, that is pornography. Because the person's mother, if his mother or her mother happens to be Muslim, she probably is wearing much more modest clothing. But even if they're Coptic Christian, and Egypt has a large Coptic Christian community, they dress very modestly as well, and they have fairly conservative religious views as well. It's not just because Muslims versus Christians. The point here is that's globalization, where you are face to face with it. And by the way, again, it's just like in this country. When people are saying, we don't want any more immigrants, it's because they're facing them. North Carolina has the largest, fastest growing Hispanic community in the United States. Do you think that does not produce anxiety in the state? Of course it does. Because people are seeing things changing and it seems to be out of their control. And I'm not talking about right or wrong here. Please do not, it's not the issue for me. The issue is these are realities. So in the Middle East, the United States does not come to represent that early Dodge Hall that I told you about, education, enlightenment, democracy. Now it represents this. I mean, taking the icon of the United States, the Statue of Liberty, and turning her into a skeleton. What's that about? It's death. It's not, I mean, the very symbol of hope and life is turned into a symbol of death. Because for them, those on the receiving end, at least the majority of the population, of course, the elites of these countries are doing very well and they love the United States because they're gaining their power. But the people, the majority of the people see this as the United States supports and keeps in place regimes that are oppressive, politically, economically corrupt, and certainly morally corrupt. And all that we ever get are McDonald's and Baywatch. Now, I grant you that if we were getting something from the Chinese that is just the crap of their society, I think we would be a little ticked off. In fact, there are people now that are refusing to buy Chinese-made products because they're trying to make a point that Chinese is overrunning us, including my brother-in-law. He thinks that we should not buy anything Chinese, which is really kind of remarkable because I told him he's going to have to run around naked and pretty much not live. But to him, it's kind of like striking a blow against China. But again, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with it, is not the point. But the point is that's the anxiety I'm talking about. Does this make sense, guys? All right. Now, at the same time that this is going up, the United States has an image of the Middle East. It has had an image of the Middle East for a long time, from the 17th, all the way up to the 18th century, right? 1950s. And seriously, what's up with the daggers? It's like, when you turn 8, your father gives you a dagger as an Arab boy. It's like a bar mitzvah, to borrow from the Jewish faith. At bar mitzvah, they give you a little dagger. And it's always curved. It's like, what, we cannot do a straight one? So, and we're always yelling. And you have to make sure that you put a kafiyah on top of them to make sure that you know that they're Arab. Because if you take it off, they could be South Asian, they could be Venezuelan, they could be, I don't know, from, Raleigh. Who knows? But you put a kafiyah, you know they're Arab, right? One of my favorite films, it's called Delta Force. And Delta Force is with that fantastic, brilliant actor, Chuck Norris. The guy has so much depth. And I watched this film, by the way, in Lebanon. It's based on a real episode. There was a hijacking in the, I'd say, late 1970s, early 80s, of a Transworld Airlines. This is an American airline. The company is no longer in business. It gets hijacked, lands in the airport in Beirut, and there's negotiations. Unfortunately, 3 people are killed, but there are negotiations, and then the plane departs after that. In the film, which is made by 2 Israeli cousins who made a series of these B films in the 80s, in the film, there's a scene in which the plane is coming in. And there is a pilot and a co-pilot, and there's a civilian behind them. I mean, of course, today that would be unacceptable. But more importantly, the window is open. I've never seen a plane land with the window open. You can just imagine a little bit of the wind hitting you in the face kind of thing, but it doesn't matter. And they're landing, and they're kind of taxiing in, and the scene cuts to a bunch of guys like these, but they're carrying World War I issue, World War II issue weapons. And they're literally saying this, rah, 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 rah. Now, this is Arabic. The language of 1,600 years of civilization, philosophy, science, religion, poetry, love, hate, family life, food, culture. It's a cultural language. It's a language that actually stretches all the way from East Asia to West Africa, right? It's a language that becomes, the lingua franca, the language. While we take English to be today, in the medieval times, Arabic was the language. It becomes dogs barking. And so the pilot, or I think the co-pilot says, who are they? And of course, the camera cuts back to that, rah, 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 and then cuts back to the civilian. And he looks very meaningful at the camera. He says, they're Arabs. And then it cuts back to them. They're barking again. Then it comes back to the pilot who says, how do you know? Then back to them barking with the weapons, and then back to the civilian who says, I know. Right? Right that moment, this is all you need to know about these people. There is no rationality. I mean, I'm sorry, this is not rational. These are a bunch of barking wild dogs. And what do you do usually with sort of rabid-looking dogs? Not nice dogs. I'm talking about, forget the nice dogs. Don't touch them. I'm talking about rabid dogs. You shoot them usually. Euthanasia, whatever the term is. The point is, you cannot converse with people like that. You cannot rationalize with people like that because they don't share your values. They are inherently violent. And if you want to do an exercise, go to YouTube, our source of all information now, and search for Planet of the Arabs. And you can tell it's a play on Planet of the Apes. And in Planet of the Arabs, it's basically a collage of films made in Hollywood from the silent era until yesterday almost, in which it shows a representation of Arabs. And by the way, Arabs are not unique. You can look at Italians and mafiosos, right? Colombians and drugs. African Americans and, well, so many different negative stereotypes, I can't think of one right now. The point is, ethnic communities in the United States are usually represented fairly negatively, but what's amazing about Arabs is there's not a single attempt at a positive one. From Valentino in the film The Sheik, as they used to call him, or the Sheikh, who was a lecherous guy who was after white women, again, the anxieties of the 1920s and immigration, to, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was just killing a lot of people. And the power of this is that to go back to the film Delta Force, I watched it in Lebanon. My friends decided that it would be a good thing for us to go watch this movie. Now here we are, the Lebanese guys, sitting in a movie theater watching Chuck Norris kill a lot of people. I mean, he was killing us in essence. And people were whistling and clapping, yeah! Like, and I looked at my friend and I said, you know he's killing us, right? I don't know, you shouldn't be on the side of us. This is how powerful this is, that even the people who are supposed to be killed as the bad guys, their descendants or whatever relatives, they're cheering the white guy on. It's like, yeah, kill us more, please. That's the power of Hollywood and popular imagination. So my point is, at the same time that we were intervening in this area, we were developing a notion of this region as an irrational, violent place. And in fact, many policymakers made the argument the only thing Arabs understood was violence. And I'm really not making this up. So, if our understanding of the region is based on this incredibly negative representation, then in many ways, some people have argued that is a prelude for our constant intervention in the region. We have sent troops into the area repeatedly, over and over again. Now, we can argue, sometimes justifiably I would say, that we only sent troops to protect our interests. Okay. But the problem is, again, if we're looking at the United States military interventions in the region, the wars, for people on the receiving end, that doesn't justify it one iota. It doesn't justify it one thing. I want to fast forward. So this is just a list of interventions. But I want to fast forward to 9/11, because I want to finish with that soon. All right. We have intervened again and again to either protect regimes that are allied with the United States or to overthrow regimes that we deem to be anti-American. And again, you might very well make the argument we have every right to do that. And you can make a valid argument. I'm not saying you can't. You can make an argument that we have every right to send in troops anytime we feel our interests are threatened. And that's fine. But the point that you need to understand, you can do that, but there are also consequences. You can send troops in, of course, and you can declare victory, of course, but there is a consequence, and you better live with that consequence. So, let's take 9/11 for example. And I think 9/11, in many ways, is the height, or I should put it this way. Until 9/11, or a little bit before that, I would argue that I had not sensed so much anti-American sentiment when I was growing up. It's not that people didn't criticize the United States, but they tended to be a little bit more measured. But after 9/11, things went south very quickly. What's with the expression things go south? Why is that things go south means bad things? Because in Arabic, sometimes we sort of use south as a bad place. It's a weird kind of concept. Anyway, back to reality. So 9/11, of course, is when you have a group of fairly radicalized individuals who carry out a horrendous terrorist attack against the United States. It didn't happen out of the blue. They used Islamic ideology, of course, but it happened because they claimed the United States had been killing Muslims and Arabs for long enough, and now it's time for payback. Again, I'm not agreeing or disagreeing. This is not the issue. It was a heinous act. It should not have happened. But here's what we did, and this is what I think was very striking, is that the minute it happened, we didn't sort of identify, okay, there's an organization. It has nothing to do with the rest of the Muslims in the world. And it certainly has nothing to do with the Middle East because these guys came from Afghanistan, which is not in the Middle East, it's in Central Asia. We focus on that. Literally, on September 12th, the conversation began, how do we topple Saddam Hussein in Iraq? Right? That's the next conversation. So September 11th happened. Dick Cheney convenes. Dick Cheney was the vice president of the United States at the time. Dick Cheney convenes a National Security Council meeting in which the conversation was, how do we attack Iraq? Now, imagine for a moment in your mind where Afghanistan is, here, and where Iraq is, here. They're separated by culture, language, politics, history, and a lot of thousand miles. And Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Nothing. Mr. Cheney spent a year, he actually sent investigators throughout the world trying to find a link, and there was no link. Ultimately, for us, this was a moment to reshape the Middle East. It was a group of people that we come to know as the neoconservatives who saw this as an opportunity, finally, to reshape in the Middle East into a place that is very good to American interests and certainly very good for the state of Israel. And so we took this moment. Again, you can argue, well, okay, so what? This is life. This is realpolitik. This is how politics is run. You don't have to be hard-nosed, and you have to take any opportunity you can to do what you want. Fine. But here's the result. And I mean, how the moment, if you will, how it's represented in two ways. For us, on CNN, we saw the toppling of a statue representing Saddam Hussein, at that point the ruler, very ruthless and horrible man, ruler of Iraq. And there were about a few dozen people, mostly American soldiers, who were surrounding it for the cameras. But for most people in the region, again, look at the Statue of Liberty representation. This is what Iraq invasion was. So we come in with a narrative. Iraq is a threat to the interests of the United States. No evidence. We actually lied all the way through. Second, we invade a country. Now, and we say that we are there to liberate the people. That's the notion. But I want you to think for a little bit about how war plays out on the other side. I think it's very important to understand what war does to the bodies and minds and communities and families and lives of people who are asked to go fight a war, American servicemen and women. That is very important to understand. But I also want you to understand something, that the bombs that are being dropped have an impact on the bodies and minds and lives and communities of people there. Long after the camera stops rolling, that big hole that from a smart or a dumb bomb that has been dropped continues to shatter lives. From simple things such as pain, when the weather turns cold, to losing somebody and trying to figure out how the heck to rebuild your house and how to take a society left in tatters and put it back together. I think the moment for a lot of Arabs, and the difference is this. When the American press showed the war, generally speaking, it was primarily focused, almost breathlessly, on American servicemen and women and what they're doing. Understood. But Al Jazeera, the premier news outlet for a lot of people, were sitting on the other side, and the cameras continued to roll. And they were focused on what the United States was doing to the Iraqis. And since this was not the first time, they had done it before in Iraq as well, in 1992 and 1993. So ultimately then, for most people on the viewing side of the Arab world, what they saw is people that look like them that are being, in essence, butchered. Day in, day out. Buildings collapsing, children being pulled out of schools. We can excuse it. We can say, look, this was a mistake, the school. Sorry, we didn't mean that. Those are hollow words. For them on the receiving end, it's your responsibility. It's America's fault. And so the war becomes to them an attempt to attack them for no reason, right? So when we, in 9/11, reflected on the notions, like, we were all puzzled. I remember the moment it happened, by the way. I know exactly what I was doing to this day, and I will remember the rest of my life. And I remember for a year after, I went around North Carolina and the United States giving 300 talks in 1 year. And every time people say, why do they hate us? You know, there's a problematic aspect of the question. But that was a puzzle. Why? Why would anybody do this to us? What have we done to them? Now take that sense of puzzlement and magnify it about 1 million times, and you can understand what people in the Middle East are thinking. It's like, why would you do this to us? Why would you destroy a country and bomb it back to medieval times, Iraq? Why would you participate in destabilizing a region and allow these radical organizations like ISIS to have a haven, safe haven to play? See, most people see ISIS, or Daesh as it's called in Arabic, not as a product of Islam, but the product of the destruction of states that previously had controlled the environment, and now they are gone, and or we are left with our political vacuums that allow these radical organizations to emerge. So, for many people, they have argued that the Iraq War and subsequent occupation, and then the Arab Spring that sort of coursed through the region, are in many ways the end of this American century, the end of this period in which the United States was all-powerful, almighty in the region, and had the ability to control the region. Because now you have China and Russia who are playing a key role. Now you have Saudi Arabia and Iran that are playing regional roles. But most importantly, for the people in the region, when you talk to people in the region today, and there are so many different opinions, so it's not like there's a single one by any means. But generally speaking, in the region now, there's a sense of we don't know where we're going. Whatever we had was destroyed, the wars and the American interventions. plus, of course, internal issues. It's not just the United States. Whatever we had is gone. It's in rubble. The moment we tried to create a new type of society, the Arab Spring, that didn't go anywhere because, again, the old regimes such as Saudi Arabia and other countries didn't let it go. The region seems to be completely falling apart in conflict, and nobody seems to know where to go from here, right? But the problem with all of this is that from our perspective as Americans, that we bear the responsibility for this in the eyes of many people, and in some ways, that is going to come back to haunt us in the future. Thank you so much. All right, so we have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. Is that right? You fool me, you're scratching your head.
So what do you think it's going to take for us to kind of have that common ground where we can just talk to each other, have that conversation, where we understand that culture and they understand our culture, and there's not so much hostility towards those cultures?
So the question is, what is it going to take to sort of create a new type of relationship? Look, I think, first of all, one of the key elements to understand is that, of course, societies have particular cultures, right? When I came here from California, it was a culture shock for me. I had done all my education in California, both in Southern California, but more importantly in Northern California, and then I arrived in North Carolina, and I'm like, wow, this is really different. Right? So there are differences. But what is really interesting is that when you go down to the core of things, there are also a lot of similarities. So for the last 25 years, there's been a poll, a survey that's been done in, I think, about 20 nations, North Africa, Middle East, and South Asia, so Pakistan, you know. And they ask questions and the same survey questions are being asked in the United States. Things such as, you know, what we consider to be democratic values, family values, and so on and so forth. What is really remarkable is that for 25 years, the survey result, this was conducted by the Pew Center for, you know, I forgot what exactly the last name is, but anyway, every year that they do this, the results come back showing a one-to-one correlation. One-to-one, right? The only divergence is sex. Those societies tend to be much more conservative about sexuality than we are here. But if you look at other variables about family, about, you know, politics, about democracy, about what have you, there's a lot of correlation. So what I'm driving at here is sometimes we assume there's a big gap, but in fact there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more similarity. So that's one, and I think that's where you start from. Two, I think one of the hubris of empire, and I think it's really important to use that term. We think of ourselves as a nation, as a country. But we really are more than that. For at least since the Cuban War, we have been an empire. In fact, long before that. When, you know, the Mexican War, when we sort of drove out Native Americans, we haven't been an imperial presence. And I'm not using empire here as a positive or negative, but just basically I'm saying what I'm using the term empire to indicate is that we don't simply work within the boundaries of our country. We have always been reaching beyond those boundaries to control what happens around us, think Manifest Destiny, for example, in order to fit our interests. Again, you might argue that this is a good thing, but there are different ways you do that. If you look at the beginning of the 20th century, there were private as well as public investments in education, right? Does anybody know how much a cruise missile costs? Just in general.
Oh, 50 grand, 50, 75 grand.
Oh, no, it's more than that. It's got a cruise missile, a really nice one, big load.
Hellfire is 10,000.
All right, well, the cruise missiles that really kind of are launched from submarines, they run you into the few $100,000. Expensive machinery. Does anybody know how much an education costs? Depending. I mean, if you go to Wake Tech, it's an incredibly great deal. Well done, you guys. NC State, we have an excellent deal. Come to us, too, after you graduate here. The Chapel Hill is a little more expensive. Duke, well, Duke sucks anyway. Duke is $70,000 now a year. I don't know who the heck goes there anymore. But the point is, look, you invest in education, you're empowering people not only to sort of lead better lives, and that's very important because they then have investment in not being radicalized, actually, believe it or not, because most people aren't that interested in being radicalized. For example, we know that about 80% of the people who join ISIS ranks, you all know what I'm saying when I say ISIS, right? Is anybody doesn't know what it is? And if you don't be shy. Okay, you all know ISIS? Good. So 80% of the people who join because they give them $1,000 a month. This doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out, how to sort of drain the swamp, to use that term. So you invest, the other part isn't that you sort of see commonalities as well as allowing for differences, but also the fact that you invest in a different kind of diplomacy. What's called, people's diplomacy, soft diplomacy. But our problem in the last 20 years with the Middle East is that we had a hammer and everything looked like a nail. And we were just hammering away at it, right? If we just throw in more weapons, somehow that's going to solve it. Iraq, Syria, anything you think about, we'll throw in more weapons. Look, and I've worked with special forces because I used to do cultural and linguistic training for them. And those guys really know far better than I have to say policymakers, because most special forces are more interested in avoiding conflict rather than engaging conflict. Because they're smart enough. First, self-preservation. If you're shooting at somebody can shoot back. But more importantly, they understand. They're on the ground. They see it. Let me give you an example. So take something as simple as this. Before we built the U.S. Embassy in Iraq, Cairo was the largest U.S. embassy in the world. And it's a fortress. I don't know how many of you have been to Cairo, but it's like a fortress in the middle, not too far from Tahrir Square. At that time, and I think the embassy employed close to about 1,200 people, some of them local, but most of them are, from outside. Amongst American citizens working in the embassy, there were 4 Arabic speakers. 1 spoke fluently, 3 spoke broken Arabic. Now think about that for a moment, right? You are a person entrusted in taking all the data coming out of Egypt and trying to analyze what's going on the ground, and you don't speak the language of the people? And I'm not talking that you have to be writing in sort of really a high level of proficiency, but you can't even go to the street and ask somebody for a sandwich. You don't encounter them. And let me contrast this with something else. So every year until 2010, when the Arab Spring broke out in Egypt, we used to take students from NC State for a 6-week educational trip to Egypt. 6 weeks. Now these students may have taken 1 or 2 years of Arabic here at State, where we have a great program, by the way. So again, come to State. They may have taken 1 or 2 history courses with me or somebody else. But generally speaking, they were novices. The great majority had never set foot in the place. We took them there for, as I said, 6 weeks. And they lived, they had to not only take classes in Arabic, and I taught a history of Egypt class, but they also had to work, do service projects in Shubra. Shubra is one of the poorest areas, working classes environment. I mean, we took them there, and at first they were shell-shocked. I mean, because we wanted them to see, to a certain extent, poverty, because they lived in a fairly nice area called Zamalek in Egypt. But the interesting thing is this. In 5 weeks, by the end of 5 weeks, these guys were beginning to get a sense of what's going on in the streets. Because I remember this distinctly, because on week 5 we were there. This is in the summer of 2010. The students were coming to me and saying, I feel like there's a lot of tension on the street. Because I was talking to the Ba'al, the grocer, and he was, saying, it's not like they were fluent in Arabic or they had really understood the intricacies of Egyptian politics, but they could sense something. Do you get my point here? It's language. We don't invest in that. We don't invest because we think it's not important. It's better to have more weapons. Let's have bigger weapons. And the problem with that, I've seen it both in terms of my own life as well as the lives of others, weapons really never solve any problem. Ever. Ever. And Syria is an example. We, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Turks have poured weapons into Syria. And look at Syria today. Nobody knows how to get out of the morass. So again, yeah, we have a hammer, and it's good to have a hammer every now and then. I'm not a pacifist by any means. There are moments when you have to defend yourself, but not everything is a nail. Let's try a different kind of approach. And I think that to me is, well, it's not going to happen in the next 3 years, but potentially in the future is something that we can try. And again, I'm not like, just because I went to school in California, I'm not singing Kumbaya and holding hands. I understand there are bad people everywhere, but there are bad people everywhere. And if we focus only on them, we're never going to be able to create those cultural bridges that are necessary for that. Other questions? Yes?
Somebody just asked me last week, what do you teach at NC State?
What do I teach at NC State? I teach history. History of the Middle East. Sure. Yep. And we run a research center on immigration, so that's the other thing we try to focus on. Kind of a mild, non-controversial topic.
So if you kind of looked at when we pulled out of Iraq back in 2012, and well, we say pull out, but there were still high-ranking military officers and government officials.
You're right.
And then you've seen in those next 3 years, you've just seen Daesh and that territory pretty much take everything that we had gained
Sure.
back in the matter of 2 years.
Sure.
How do we necessarily empower the Iraqis to, because I was there, I was right across the street from the embassy,
Oh, wow.
and how do we empower them to, I guess you say, defend themselves, or, I mean,
Sure.
I know it's a touchy subject.
It is. It's a very good question. So, and it's a very smart question. But let me start by saying we didn't leave because we wanted to leave. We left because the Iraqis refused to sign the agreement that we wanted to agree. So Mr. Obama, who is accused of leaving Iraq too early, had to leave. He was continuing a negotiation that lasted from the Bush administration into his administration. And one of the key sticking elements is that we wanted extraterritoriality for our soldiers. In other words, if one of our soldiers got into an altercation with an Iraqi and hit that Iraqi, he should not be tried under Iraqi law. The Iraqis were refusing this because they saw that as contravening their national sovereignty. And there are other sticking issues. This is just one of the elements. Anyway, so the Iraqis in essence were refusing to allow us to stay on. We had to leave. Now the problem with terrorism in general, which is really a smart question you're asking, it's a bigger question. How do we keep people from being radicalized, whether they are 10 or 1,000 or 100,000, and attacking us and our interests, which is really at the heart of your question. Now, what I think both Afghanistan and Iraq, and subsequently Syria, have proven is that military is not the solution. That conducting war in a limited fashion may be necessary here and there to contain them, but it's not the answer. The answer is primarily, how do you create an environment that makes sure that people don't go there? So let me flip it a little bit and bring it back to the United States. We know that in the United States, we have a lot of extremists. A lot. In fact, the greatest threat to life comes primarily from white nationalists, if you look at the statistics. I mean, so if you're looking at violence, we have people who would like to commit acts of violence. We've seen them. But we have a different thing. We have something called law and order, in which we basically have organizations, institutions within this country that are constantly tracking these guys and trying to curtail them. But more importantly than the FBI or any of these organizations is we have a system that makes sure that we don't have large numbers being attracted to these organizations. And what I mean by that is the democratic system. A system in which people can voice their anger and frustrations in ways that are not going to destroy everything. Because honestly, if you think about it, we have a civil war every 4 years. Every 4 years, we have a civil war. I mean, I don't know if you were following the news for the recent elections between Mr. Trump and Ms. Clinton, but that was some pretty nasty stuff all around, right? And the fact of the matter is, the level of vitriol and anger and frustrations, if you were to weaponize that, I submit to you. In fact, I guarantee we would have had a destruction of this country. That's how much anger there was. And there is today still. And we're polarized. And by the way, this is nothing new. People think, oh, this is new. If you look at American history throughout, we've had all sorts of anger and violence. Hello, Civil War, right? But at the same time, we have mechanisms that we try to negotiate this through. Elections being one of them, although now they're being subjected to all sorts of problems. But the judiciary is another one, and a free press. All under attack today, by the way. But those are the foundations of American democracy. I mean, I have to tell you, public education, where you guys are sitting, is the bulwark of democracy. I came to this country when I was 17. In 1978, I came from a war-torn country in Lebanon. I came here, and I was astounded that you can go to public school for free. I'm not romanticizing public school. Yeah, it's got issues. And yes, by the way, there's serious discrepancy between poor areas and rich areas. We know that, which is what the Leandro case in 1996 was all about. We understand that. But still, to this day, when my children went to public school and graduated, I was so proud of them. Because I didn't want to send them to a private school. Because you know why? Because public school is how you create a democratic society. You force people to come together, even when we don't like each other. But you give people opportunities as well. Those are the kind of elements that I think would be much more profound. That's the kind of investment we do. So you have to think strategically and tactically. Tactically, yes, you must contain the problem. strategically, you have to think around the issue of military. And what I mean by that is you do try to create an environment in which these ideas are thriving. And that's a long-term investment. There's no doubt about it. But for us, for example, after 9/11, we were shocked and we wanted easy answers and easy solutions. And you know better than any of us, there are no easy solutions. Because what we consider to be easy solutions from a distance means a lot of pain and agony for a lot of people. If nothing else, just a lot of blisters from carrying a 120-pound backpack. But more seriously, a lot of horrible things happen. And my worry is that we haven't quite learned yet. And I take American Sniper, the movie, as a problem, which was one of the most popular films. I don't know if you've seen it. Has anybody seen American Sniper? Yeah. If you notice, the film starts in the middle of the conflict. The bad guys really are nasty people. There are no good Iraqis, except a few cameo things, and the guy comes back. No historical context at all. And I'm not speaking just as a historian, but we cannot understand anything in the region without dealing with the history of the region. You know why? Because people live that history. They know it. They know it by heart. They still say, you remember Sykes-Picot? Even people who have no clue who Sykes or Picot was or what happened or transpired, but to them, it's shorthand for Europeans trying to intervene in their lives. That's a memory. Nasser, in essence, a black man because he was very dark, but in essence, a third worlder who was very proud as a military man because he was a military man, who was very proud to bring Egypt out. And Nasser was not a perfect man. He had all sorts of problems. He meets with John Foster Dulles, probably one of the worst Secretary of States we've ever had, and John Foster Dulles shakes his finger at him. Right after Nasser had kicked out the British and reclaimed Egypt for the Egyptians, Dulles treats him as a little brown boy, and Nasser is pissed off. Again, Dulles has no clue of what's going on here. And again, and again, and again. So the point is, we have to think strategically, historically, and go beyond this idea that we can solve this by sending in yet more troops, yet more weapons. And so to me, I think that's the critical aspect of the region. Today, Syria cannot be solved in any way, form, or shape, by the way, without bringing in the Chinese, the Iranians, the Saudis, the Turks, the Russians, and the Americans. Nobody can solve it. We can control ISIS here, but ISIS only grows in a vacuum. That's why they won, because in the northern part of Iraq, it was a vacuum, and northern Syria, they did the same thing. And it's because the state was too weak to control these areas. Afghanistan becomes a haven for Al-Qaeda and the horrors of Al-Qaeda because we had just destroyed and dismantled, and the Soviets did too, by the way, Afghanistan. These things do not emerge because there are something genetic proclivity or racial proclivity or a religious proclivity to violence. Muslims are no more, and by the way, if you think I'm defending my faith, I'm not. I'm a Christian, right? I was born and raised a Christian, and I'm continuing to be so. So I'm not a Muslim. But the point is, Muslims have no more proclivity to violence than anybody else. No, I have never seen it in my life, including in Lebanon, where actually the Christians were much more violent than the Muslims. But the point of the matter here is, it's the historical situation. When you create a vacuum, where there's no state or law and order, where there's no hope, no possibility of dreaming, people tend to become very radicalized. Very. And they tend to accept ideas that are completely insane. I give you the recent election in the United States as an example. Seriously. People who are desperate, who are very hurt by the existing system, begin to believe all sorts of insane stuff, right? And I'm, again, not because I like Clinton or I don't like Trump, it's not an issue, but I mean, Clinton running a pedophile operation out of a restaurant in DC. I mean, this is where you sit there and the light of day is going, it's like, really? You actually believe that? Of course it's BS. But people start believing insane stuff. And the National Enquirer knows that. Which is why they make so much money. I mean, have you ever read the headlines on National Enquirer? Like you're checking out and you're looking at this stuff going, what? And yet they sell. Anyway, other questions? We have 5 more minutes, I think, right?
Yeah, 3 more.
3 more.
I said 4 minutes.
Oh, yeah, 5 more. Yes.
Okay.
Hi.
I had a question about, you talk about the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the U.S. intervention. Would it be reasonable to say that the Middle East was destined for turmoil? In a sense, when I say that, because
The Middle East was what, sorry?
almost destined to still be a conflict for the U.S. The reason I state that is because of even during World War I, T. Lawrence used Arabs to help Arab tribes helped fight the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire at the time still had a lot of power plays between Armenians, Kurds, Syrians.
Yeah.
We had Muslim tourism.
Great point.
Even today, there's still a lot of places run by tribes. There's a lot of tribalism in that.
Very good point you make. So the question is about, is this region just destined to be constantly in conflict? Look, I'm a historian. And for 500 plus years under the Ottoman Empire, things weren't like perfect, but certainly things were not in so much turmoil as we see them today. Two things. One, I think you're absolutely right that there's something happening in this region that seems to generate conflict again and again. And it's not the tribes necessarily. It's not the fact, so some people have argued that the region is riven by these ethnic, religious, tribal fissures, that people don't get along. And I say to them, have you been to Thanksgiving dinner lately? Have you had a conversation in which people roll their eyes and get pissed off? Fissures and tensions and arguments are common. Have you been following conversation about race in this country? We always have fissures. The question is, how do we navigate them? The problem in the region is not simply that somebody drew a map that is a very bizarre map, and they are, but most maps are bizarre. Most maps don't make sense. Look at the United States. I mean, Hawaii and Alaska are part of the United States. I mean, come on, really, seriously? Maps don't make sense. Maps are constructs, geopolitical constructs. The question is what happens within the maps that's important. So one of the things about the region is that oil has been the curse of the region. And that, you're absolutely right. In that sense, there is a sense of destiny. Because oil is such a vital resource, at least until recently, it constantly invites outside intervention. But not only does it constantly invite outside intervention, as we've seen with the Chinese, with the Americans, with the Soviets, but also it allows few people so much independent power that they are not subject to sovereignty laws. What I mean by that, if you as a nation, if you as few hundred princes and princesses own untold fortunes in oil, you do not need to turn to your people and ask them, do I have the legitimacy to rule? You have oil. You can buy people off. So the Arab Spring happens in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia decides to give everybody, not Saudi Arabia, the king gives everybody an extra $1,000 bonus in a month for a year in their paycheck. I wrote the chancellor and asked him if that's possible at NC State. Didn't get a response. I don't know why. The point is, oil doesn't just invite intervention, and it has, but it also allows few people like Saddam Hussein or the kings of Saudi Arabia to have power, to wield and use their power in a way that is unchecked by popular sovereignty. They don't need the people to like them or not like them. They have the resources. Do you get my point here? You can fund a police force, you can fund an army, and you can buy loyalty. I mean, one of the biggest problems, for example, is that Saddam Hussein, we knew this later when the papers were released, he had an ongoing operation in which he literally bought out every critic of his regime. They would just bankroll him, and then they would be very nice to him. And they would say how great he is. That is oil money. So oil has been a profoundly problematic aspect of things. The fissures that we're seeing that lead to these problems can be resolved. They can. And there was a liberal experiment in the Middle East until World War I. If you look at the Middle East, and actually I would argue even after World War I all the way to World War II, there was a liberal experiment in which people were beginning to get at this idea of how do we navigate these tensions. The problem is both World War I and World War II completely interrupted them. And then Israel was created, and that becomes a big problem as well. And that's when a lot of the stuff falls apart. So in many ways, I also would like to end by saying these countries are very young. Most of them are about 60, 70 years old. We had a civil war 100 years into the creation of the United States. We had a civil war that still today has killed more Americans than any other war percentage-wise we've engaged in. These are young regimes. And we had the blessings of two major oceans blocking every intervention. The Middle East doesn't. The Middle East is in the midst of a place where from Asia, from Europe, from the United States, people are constantly coming in, and yet people are struggling to try to figure it out. And to leave you on a very hopeful note, all you have to do is look at the youth of the region. They are a remarkable bunch, people your age. Not only do they carry out the Arab Spring, but more importantly, they're constantly trying to figure out how to create a better world. That to me is a testament to the kind of people that you have there. It's not to say they're all heroes or these empty words. That's not it. It's that they struggle to try to figure out, how do I create a new piece of music? Right? How do I create a small NGO to clean up the neighborhood? How do I get a job? It's that kind of day in, day out. And this is all in the midst of somebody shooting at you. Right? I mean, most of us, if somebody's shooting at us, we're just like going, crying for mommy. I usually do that anyway. But these guys are trying to create a world, a society, in the midst of one of the most difficult periods in the history of the region. But as a historian, I can tell you I'm very hopeful, because it will pass. Thank you so much.